The smell of age and decay lingered in the humid air, a signature of the weekly flea market. The narrow alleyways between the stalls were crammed with the forgotten relics of the past: tarnished silverware, frayed tapestries, records from bands long forgotten, dust-covered memories for sale. Ellie breathed it all in, her eyes alive with excitement. To her, this was paradise. "Ellie, come on, we've been here for hours," Mike groaned from behind her. He was lagging as usual, his tall frame slouched as he kicked at a cracked vase on the ground. "We're leaving soon," Ellie said, eyes still scanning the rows of old cameras. She didn't care if Mike was tired. This was what she lived for. She loved retro photography, loved the magic of capturing a moment in time through old analog lenses. Digital cameras were too perfect, too sterile. But an old camera? That had character, life. She just hadn't found the right one today. Not yet. Jade and Liam were off somewhere, probably haggling over vintage records or quirky pieces of jewelry. But Ellie was on a mission. She moved carefully through the aisle, the tips of her fingers grazing the cool, metallic bodies of the cameras on display. Nothing stood out, and then she saw it, half hidden beneath a pile of rusted tools and chipped porcelain. The leather strap of a camera dangled lazily, almost as if waiting for her to find it. Ellie's heart gave a small, excited leap. She reached for it, pulling it free from its forgotten corner. The camera was old, older than anything else she had seen today. The body was heavy and slightly battered, with a cracked leather grip and a small emblem embossed on its side. A Polaroid. "Look at this," Ellie breathed, holding it up. Mike frowned as he walked over. "That thing's ancient. Does it even work?" Ellie ignored him, turning the camera over in her hands. It felt right, the weight of it, the roughness. She pressed the shutter button experimentally, hearing the familiar, satisfying click. She smiled. "Only one way to find out," she said, her voice rising with excitement. At that moment, Jade and Liam reappeared, arms full of records and jewelry, both looking confused by Ellie's enthusiasm. "What did you find now?" Jade asked, grinning as she saw the camera in Ellie's hands. "A Polaroid," Ellie said, unable to contain her excitement. "And it's perfect." Liam chuckled. "You're like a kid in a candy store." Ellie turned toward the stall owner, an old man sitting quietly on a worn stool. He had been watching her the entire time, his wrinkled hands folded in his lap. His eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone his age, gleaming with a strange intensity. "How much for the camera?" Ellie asked. The old man smiled, his thin lips stretching too wide. "Ah, that old thing. I haven't had much luck selling it, to be honest. Not many people interested in such unique items these days." Ellie raised an eyebrow, already calculating the best price she could haggle down to. "Well, I'm interested, so how much?" He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "For you, young lady, $20. 15, Ellie countered. The game was on. The old man's grin faltered just a little before he nodded. 15 it is, but I should warn you, be careful what you capture. Some moments aren't meant to be kept." The others shifted uncomfortably, but Ellie laughed it off. "Sure, we'll keep that in mind," she said, handing over the cash. The man's hand lingered on hers for a moment longer than was comfortable, his skin cold and dry like paper. "Enjoy it while it lasts." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning Ellie didn't quite understand. She pulled her hand away, quickly packing the camera in her bag. The group moved on, the old man's gaze following them as they disappeared into the market crowd. Back at Ellie's apartment, the four of them crowded around her small coffee table, the camera resting proudly in the middle. Ellie rummaged through her old photography supplies, finally finding a few unopened packs of Polaroid film. "This is gonna be so cool," Jade said, bouncing in her seat. I've never used an actual Polaroid before. Ellie smiled as she loaded the film. That's the magic of it. No filters, no edits. Just the raw moment as it was. She snapped a picture of Jade first, the Polaroid whirring as the film slid out, slow and mechanical. Jade grabbed it eagerly, waving it in the air as the image slowly developed. They all leaned in closer as the picture took form. It was a simple shot, Jade laughing, her bright red hair messy, her eyes crinkled with joy. But something was slightly off. The background, which should have been the apartment's white walls, seemed darker, shadowed in a way that didn't make sense. And though Jade had been laughing, the image showed her looking over her shoulder, her smile fading into a faint frown. "That's weird," Liam muttered. "It's probably just old film," Ellie said quickly, though something tugged at the back of her mind. She waved it off. They took more pictures, each one a little stranger than the last. Mike's photo showed him sitting in Ellie's armchair, but his expression wasn't the casual smile he'd been wearing. It was blank, almost as if he was deep in thought. Liam's image was the oddest. Though he'd been standing by the window in the photo, he appeared to be just outside, standing in the rain. But there hadn't been any rain. They laughed it off, chalking it up to the quirks of an old camera. But a part of Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. "Well, this was fun," Mike said, standing up and stretching. "But we should probably head out. I've got an early class tomorrow." The others followed suit, packing up their things and making their way to the door. But as they left, Ellie stayed behind, lingering by the camera. She reached out and touched it gently, her fingers tracing the cool metal surface. It felt alive. That night, as she lay in bed, Ellie stared at the Polaroid camera sitting on her desk, illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight. The old man's words echoed in her mind, sending a chill down her spine. "Be careful what you capture." She didn't sleep well that night. None of them did. The first unsettling moment came the next morning. It wasn't dramatic, just a brief flicker of discomfort that settled in Ellie's gut. Mike had sent a text to their group chat, casually mentioning a strange coincidence. "Yo, guys, that pic you took of me last night? I was sitting in that exact chair this morning, staring out the window just like in the photo. Didn't even realize it until I got up. Weird, right?" Ellie stared at the message for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the reply button. She could picture it. Mike slouched in her armchair, coffee in hand, his expression matching the vacant look in the Polaroid they'd taken. The same empty gaze. At the time, they'd all laughed about how the photo hadn't quite captured his real smile. Now, the image felt like a prediction. Brushing off her unease, Ellie shot back a quick response. "It's just an old camera, Mike. Probably a glitch. Don't overthink it." But she couldn't stop thinking about it herself. By the end of the week, the photos became more unnerving. Ellie had avoided using the camera for a few days, letting it sit untouched on her desk. But as Friday night rolled around, the group gathered again at her apartment, like they always did. Inevitably, the camera was brought out. Ellie snapped pictures while they talked and joked, trying to shake the strange feeling that had been creeping up on her since Mike's text. The photos developed slowly, one by one, as they always did. But this time, they weren't just off. They were wrong. Jade's picture showed her sitting on Ellie's couch, smiling, just as she had been moments before. Except in the photo, her hand was trembling. In real life, Jade had been completely still. But in the image, her fingers were a blur, vibrating with the nervous energy that hadn't existed when Ellie had taken the shot. "What the hell?" Jade murmured, staring down at the picture. "That's weird." Ellie leaned closer, her heart pounding. "You weren't moving." "I know I wasn't." Jade looked up, meeting Ellie's gaze. "But it looks like I was." They all laughed awkwardly, the tension palpable. Ellie quickly snapped a picture of Mike and Liam, hoping for something more ordinary, something that would prove the camera was just old and glitchy. But as the film slid out and began to develop, her stomach twisted. Mike's photo showed him sitting in the same armchair as before, but this time his face was entirely blank, expressionless, emotionless. His eyes were hollow, staring ahead into nothing. It was as if the life had been drained from him. The sight of it made Ellie's skin crawl. Liam's photo was no better. It showed him standing by the window, but in the picture, rain was pouring down outside, heavy and relentless. He looked pale, almost sickly, as if the rain was soaking into his skin. But outside, in the real world, the sky was clear. The moon hung high in a cloudless sky. Liam frowned, flipping the picture over in his hands as if expecting to find an explanation written on the back. "It was clear when you took this," he muttered. "Why does it look like I'm standing in the rain?" Ellie didn't have an answer. No one did. The room was silent, the weight of the moment settling over them like a thick fog. Mike broke the tension first, standing abruptly. "All right, this thing is getting a little too weird for me. Maybe the old guy at the market sold you a busted camera." Ellie nodded, though she knew it wasn't the camera. At least not in the way Mike thought. There was something else, something darker, lurking beneath the surface. She could feel it like a shadow pressing against her chest, but she couldn't say that. Not yet. The group quickly dispersed after that, leaving Ellie alone with the camera once more. The last of the Polaroids lay in front of her, their disturbing images staring back at her from the coffee table. Mike's hollow eyes, Jade's trembling hands, Liam soaked in rain that didn't exist. She hated it, hated how the camera made her feel like something was coming, something inevitable. But then she made a mistake. Ellie couldn't stop herself from taking one more picture. She didn't know why she did it. Curiosity, maybe. Or fear. She held the camera in her hands, feeling the familiar weight of it, her fingers brushing over its cold metal surface. It felt alive beneath her touch. She raised it slowly, pointing it at herself in the mirror. Her heart raced as she pressed the shutter. The familiar whirring sound filled the silence, and the film slid out, developing in her trembling hands. The image appeared slowly, as they always did. But this one was worse, so much worse. It showed her lying on the floor, her body twisted at an unnatural angle. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly at the ceiling, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. The edges of the photo were smeared with dark shadows, almost as if the light itself had been swallowed up. And there was blood, so much blood. Ellie dropped the photo, her breath catching in her throat. The room felt suddenly colder, the shadows deeper. She stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. This wasn't just some glitch. This was a warning. She stared at the fallen photo, the image still haunting her mind. The blood, the terror in her own eyes. It all felt too real. It was real. Over the next few days, Ellie tried to avoid thinking about the camera, but it was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw that final image, the one where she lay dead on the floor, her life drained away. She thought about throwing the camera out, but a strange part of her was afraid that even if she got rid of it, the future it had shown her would still come true. And it wasn't just her. Everyone else in the group had their own versions of the same creeping dread. They stopped mentioning the camera, but the tension between them grew. Mike became quiet, withdrawn. Jade's hands actually started to tremble in real life, and Liam avoided standing near the windows altogether. It was as if the photos were seeping into reality, taking root in their lives and warping their futures. Finally, on a cold, rainy evening, Ellie called the group together. They sat in her living room, a storm raging outside, the sound of thunder vibrating through the walls. The camera sat on the table between them, like a predator waiting for its next move. "We need to stop using it," Ellie said, her voice shaking. I I think it's showing us what's going to happen. What's really going to happen. Mike scoffed, but it was half-hearted. Come on, Ellie, it's just a camera. An old one. Then how do you explain the photos? Jade asked, her voice tense. Why do they keep matching up with what actually happens later? They all fell silent, the truth hanging heavy between them. Ellie knew they had to make a choice. Either they could continue using the camera, digging deeper into the mystery that surrounded it, or they could walk away. But even if they walked away, Ellie wasn't sure if it would be enough to save them. The camera didn't just capture images, it captured futures, and they had already seen too much. As the storm howled outside, Ellie couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. The rain poured relentlessly against the windows, blurring the world outside as Ellie, Mike, Jade, and Liam sat huddled in her dimly lit apartment. The Polaroid camera rested on the coffee table between them, casting a long shadow that seemed to stretch and twist in the flickering candlelight. The weight of what they had discovered pressed heavily on their minds. They had all seen the pictures. They had all felt the creeping chill of inevitability. The Polaroid wasn't just capturing moments, it was capturing fate, their futures playing out in vivid, horrifying detail. And no matter what they did, the images seemed to come true. The silence in the room was thick, broken only by the constant rhythm of the storm outside. Finally, Mike spoke, his voice rough and low. We can't keep pretending this is just a coincidence. The pictures, they're real. They're showing us what's going to happen. Ellie nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her cup of cold coffee. The image of herself, dead, twisted on the floor, was still burned into her mind. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it. The blood, the terror, the finality. She had tried to avoid it, tried to pretend it was just an anomaly, but deep down she knew it was the truth. We have to stop taking pictures, Jade said, her voice almost pleading. Her hands, once steady, now trembled constantly, just like in the photo Ellie had taken. We can't let this keep happening. But it's not that simple, is it? Liam's voice cut through the room, sharper than usual. He leaned forward, his eyes dark and serious. You've all noticed what happens when we try to avoid what the photos show us, right? Ellie glanced at him, a knot forming in her stomach. Of course, she had noticed. They all had. The day after Jade's photo, she had refused to go to the park bench where the image showed her sitting. Instead, a jogger had collapsed and died in that exact spot. And when Mike had avoided sitting in the coffee shop, like in his picture, a car had crashed through the front window, killing an elderly couple. Every time they tried to change their own fate, someone else paid the price. We can't just ignore it, Liam continued. If we do, it'll just be someone else. It's like the camera has to claim a life, no matter what. If it's not one of us, it's someone else. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air, the truth of it sinking in. They couldn't escape the camera's curse. Even if they managed to avoid the futures it showed them, someone else would die in their place. The realization hit Ellie hard, like a punch to the gut. They were trapped, caught in a game they couldn't win. So what then? Mike asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. Are we just supposed to let it happen? Let ourselves die because the camera says so? Liam's jaw clenched. I don't know, but if we keep dodging what the camera shows us, we're no better than the ones causing these deaths. I saw the news about that jogger, Ellie. That should have been Jade. Jade shivered and wrapped her arms around herself. The guilt of that moment had weighed heavily on her ever since. She hadn't even known the woman who had died, but the thought that her decision had led to that person's death was unbearable. It wasn't fair. None of it was. There has to be another way, Ellie muttered, staring down at the camera. It sat there, silent and menacing, as if it knew exactly what it was doing. We can't just sit here and wait to die. But even as she said it, she knew the truth. The camera was a force beyond their understanding, beyond their control. Whatever power it held was ancient, woven into its very existence. They could no more stop it than they could stop the rain from falling. The only question left was whether they would be the ones to pay the price, or if they would continue letting others die in their place. In the following days, they each tried, in their own ways, to outrun the fate the camera had shown them. But no matter what they did, the results were the same. The Polaroid pictures were a ticking clock, counting down to their inevitable end. Jade became increasingly desperate, obsessively scanning news reports and social media, trying to track the collateral damage of their actions. Every life lost weighed heavier on her conscience, gnawing at her mind. She barely slept, and when she did, the nightmares came. Images of people dying in her place, their faces twisted with blame. Mike, on the other hand, grew angrier by the day. His attempts to avoid his fate seemed futile, and the frustration was eating away at him. He hated feeling powerless, hated knowing that the camera was in control. He had always prided himself on his ability to solve problems. But this was different. No matter how much logic he applied, there was no solution. Liam, meanwhile, had grown disturbingly calm. He seemed resigned to the fact that they couldn't escape their futures. Instead, he focused on studying the camera itself, trying to understand its power, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there was a way to beat it. He spent hours researching old folklore, ancient curses, anything that might give them a clue. But the more he uncovered, the darker the truth became. Ellie watched her friends unravel, the tension between them growing with each passing day. She had started avoiding looking at her own Polaroid, terrified that it would happen sooner than she expected. Every time she walked through her apartment, she imagined the scene from the photo playing out. Her body crumpled on the floor, blood pooling beneath her. The weight of it all was unbearable. A week later, the group gathered at Ellie's place once more, each of them weary, their nerves frayed. They hadn't spoken much about the camera, but it hung over them like a storm cloud, dark and heavy. Jade broke the silence first, her voice trembling. "We can't keep doing this. Every time we avoid our own deaths, someone else dies. I can't live with that anymore." Mike slammed his fist down on the table, causing them all to jump. "So what, Jade? We just... What? Let ourselves die?" "Maybe," Jade whispered, her eyes welling with tears. "Maybe that's the only way to stop it." "No," Mike said firmly, his jaw tight. "I'm not giving up. There has to be another way." Ellie's heart pounded in her chest as she looked around the room. They were standing on the edge of something dark, something inevitable. She felt it deep in her bones, the creeping certainty that no matter what they chose, they were already doomed. Liam leaned forward, his eyes locked on the camera. "We need to figure out the rules. There's always a way to beat these things, but we're running out of time." Ellie shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "What if there isn't a way? What if we're just playing a game we can't win?" They all fell silent, the enormity of their situation crashing down around them. The camera sat between them, a silent witness to their suffering, its dark lens gleaming in the dim light. Ellie's thoughts drifted back to the old man at the flea market, to his cryptic warning, "Be careful what you capture." She had dismissed it at the time, but now she wondered if he had known all along, if he had known what the camera truly was. The choice was clear, but the cost was unimaginable. They could either embrace their fate, accept the deaths the camera had foretold, or they could continue running, trading their lives for the lives of strangers. Ellie closed her eyes, the weight of it all pressing down on her chest. She had started this. She had brought the camera into their lives. And now, there was no way out. The storm outside raged on, a reflection of the turmoil within them. And in that moment, Ellie knew that whatever decision they made, there would be no happy ending. The wind howled through the trees outside Ellie's apartment, rattling the windows like ghostly fingers clawing to get inside. The storm had only grown worse, mirroring the chaos within the group. The room was filled with a sense of impending doom, as if the air itself had thickened, pressing in on them from all sides. The Polaroid camera sat on the table, its dark lens watching them like an unblinking eye. It had become the centerpiece of their lives, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, of the curse that now bound them together. Each of them had tried to find a way out through research, denial, avoidance. But in the end, the camera had always been one step ahead. Its power was undeniable, unstoppable. Ellie's hand trembled as she reached for the final piece of the puzzle, the worn and crumpled article she had found in the archives. It had taken her weeks to track it down, weeks of sleepless nights and frantic research. But here it was, the truth. "I found it," she said quietly, her voice barely rising above the sound of the storm. The others turned to look at her, their faces pale and drawn. Mike was slouched in his chair, his eyes sunken with exhaustion. Jade was curled into herself, her hands still trembling, as if the camera had embedded its curse into her bones. Liam, sitting furthest from the table, watched the camera with an intensity that frightened her. Ellie swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue. The camera, it wasn't just a normal object. It was never supposed to exist like this. She glanced at the others, her voice breaking with fear. "It's a curse, and there's no escaping it." She spread the yellowed newspaper across the table, the headlines screaming up at them like a voice from the past. Mysterious deaths linked to antique camera. Curse of the Polaroid. Beneath it, a photograph of the previous owner, a man whose hollow, empty eyes seemed to echo their own growing despair. The article detailed his obsession with the camera, how he had tried to destroy it just as they had, and how every attempt had failed. His fate had been sealed long before he ever realized it. His name was Arthur McConnell, Ellie explained, her voice shaking. He was a photographer, just like us. He bought the camera from an old collector who had passed away under mysterious circumstances. McConnell thought it was just an antique. But then, the deaths started happening. Everyone he photographed, everyone, died. And when he tried to destroy it, Liam leaned forward, his voice low and dangerous. "What happened to him?" Ellie hesitated, the words heavy in her throat. "The camera killed him, just like it's going to kill us." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Jade choked back a sob, tears streaming down her pale face. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "No, we can't let that happen. There has to be a way to stop it." But Ellie shook her head. "I've looked into every legend, every piece of folklore I could find. The curse is older than any of us. The camera was created by something dark, something that feeds on lives, on souls. It's not just showing us the future, it's choosing it." "It's a pact," Mike said suddenly, his voice sharp and bitter. "One death for every picture. That's the price, isn't it?" Ellie nodded, her heart aching. "Yes. Every time we take a picture, the camera demands a life. And if it doesn't take one of us, it takes someone else." Jade collapsed into sobs, her hands covering her face as the realization hit her. Mike slammed his fist against the table, the anger he'd been holding in finally erupting. "So what? We're just supposed to sit here and wait to die?" Liam stared at the camera, his eyes locked on its cold, glassy surface. "What if we destroy it?" he asked, though the defeat in his voice was unmistakable. "What if we finally break it?" "We've tried," Ellie said softly. "We've tried everything. And so did McConnell. He burned it, smashed it, buried it. but the camera always came back untouched. It's indestructible. Mike pushed away from the table, pacing the room like a caged animal. There has to be something we're missing. There has to be. But deep down, they all knew the truth. There was no way out, no way to cheat the camera. It was part of them now, entwined with their fates, and every picture they took only brought death closer. The wind outside grew fiercer, the storm building to a crescendo. The power flickered, casting jagged shadows across the room as the candlelight wavered. They were trapped, just like McConnell had been, just like all the others before them. Ellie glanced at the camera, her heart racing with a mix of terror and resignation. I think it wants one final picture. Liam looked at her, his face pale. What do you mean? Ellie swallowed, her throat dry. It's been pushing us toward this moment. Every picture has been leading us here, and now it wants us to take one last photo. Mike stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. What are you saying, Ellie? She looked at them, her voice trembling. We take a group picture, the four of us, together. Jade recoiled, shaking her head violently. No, I'm not doing that. I'm not. Think about it, Ellie pressed, her voice growing desperate. Every picture has been leading to death. But if we take this last one, maybe it'll be over. Maybe it'll be done. Liam's jaw tightened. Or maybe it'll kill us all. Ellie met his gaze, her eyes filled with a deep, hopeless sorrow. Maybe, but it's either that or we keep running, letting more people die in our place. I don't know about you, but I can't live with that guilt anymore. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Each of them weighed the impossible decision before them. There was no good choice, no way to escape the looming shadow of the camera's curse. But maybe, just maybe, this would be the end. Mike stepped forward first, his face set with grim determination. Fine, let's do it. Jade sobbed quietly but nodded, her hands shaking as she wiped her tears away. Liam hesitated, his eyes locked on the camera before finally standing and joining the others. Ellie picked up the Polaroid, her hands trembling as she loaded the last strip of film. The camera felt heavier than it ever had before, as if it knew this was the final act. She stood in front of her friends, the lens aimed at them. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. We stand together, she said, her voice barely audible, no matter what happens. The others nodded, gathering close, their faces pale but resolute. Ellie took a deep breath and pressed the shutter. The familiar whir of the camera filled the room, followed by the soft sound of the film sliding out. The moment hung in the air, suspended, as they all stood frozen, waiting. Ellie took the photo in her hands, watching as it developed. Slowly, painfully, the image appeared, the dark shapes of their bodies coming into focus. Her breath caught in her throat. The picture showed them all, lying in a twisted heap on the floor, their bodies broken, blood pooling beneath them. None of them were alive. A cold wave of dread washed over her, and as the others leaned in to see the image, their faces fell into silent horror. It was over. The camera had won. The wind outside screamed against the walls, and the lights flickered one last time before plunging the room into darkness. And then there was nothing.